So welcome to the first session of the fourth LLF in New York. And as Razi mentioned in his introductory remarks, the first session rightly celebrates Lahore and explores the legacy, the living legacy of a very rich artistic tradition, a very rich poetic and cultural past of Lahore, which is now still informs the national debates, the national cultural movements, etc. So I'm not going to speak a lot because we have a lot to cover with very esteemed panelists. Before we start, I'll quickly introduce Professor Iftikhar Dadi. He needs no introduction. He's an associate professor at Cornell in history of art, and he is also the director of the South Asia Studies Center at Cornell University. He's author of several books on Muslim modernism and a renowned art historian from Pakistan. Salima Hashmi also again everybody knows her, but let me introduce educator, artist, a mentor to many present-day artists, and of course a cultural icon of our times, if I may add. And Khaled Ahmed, who I'm really privileged to be next to him. He has been my personal mentor as well. We've worked together in the Friday Times, but he's currently the contributing editor for the Newsweek Lahore, which prints from Lahore. He is also a regular columnist at the Indian Express. He's author of several books, and of course a sort of very well recognized name on Pakistan's current affairs and its history of extremism in recent years. So we'll begin the session with Professor Dadi's presentation, and maybe you can take the podium.
Sure. So, many thanks to Razi and all the organizers for having LLF here and for inviting me. I wanted to talk about the relation between art and literature over the course of the 20th century. And one of the things to understand is that when modern art first emerges in Lahore, it's not necessarily legible. In other words, it has to be made critically and intellectually legible through, and that happens through a kind of a relationship with literature. So I'm going to look at three episodes. One is sort of the early to mid-20th century, and the second is mid-20th century, and the third is a little bit later. A key sort of player in my presentation is what was the Mayo School of Art, which then becomes the National College of Art. So let's begin with this image, which is actually a Mughal miniature, which shows, the title is given later, of course, but it's called A Thoughtful Man, which shows perhaps a poet reflecting in a garden. When we think about Abdurrahman Chughtai's etching, Mughal artist from the 30s, okay, we see the Mughal artist in a kind of a similar relationship, in a reflective and a pensive state in a landscape. However, the Mughal artist, this is in some ways this is a fanciful rendition of a Mughal artist by Chughtai, because the Mughal artist of the 17th century was not this figure. Okay, so in some ways, Chughtai is innovative in two ways. Okay, so one is that he is claiming a pensive, reflective, philosophical, and critical position for the artist that actually was not the case for the Mughal artist necessarily in the 17th century. Okay, and the second way in which Chughtai is innovative is that he is a product of print culture. Okay, so he's a very smart and innovative exploiter, okay, of the possibilities that are opened up through print culture. So in some ways, as much as Chughtai wants to be the Mughal artist, he's actually not the Mughal artist, right? Okay. One of the ways in which Chughtai begins to think about his career and his trajectory as an artist is through his relationship with what's happening in Calcutta. Calcutta, from the beginning of the 20th century, is really a major site for a new way of painting, which is the Bengal school, and we need to think about Chughtai's practice in relation to the Bengal school as well. Okay, but also Calcutta is a major center for publishing, the publishing on art. And this particular sort of series of illustrated plates, okay, was called Chatterjee's Picture Albums that were published in many editions, and Chughtai featured in almost all of them. And he's the only artist from Lahore who features in almost all of them, right? In fact, the art historian Partha Mitter says, in Calcutta, art came to hold center stage in cultural politics. Annotated art, plates in magazines, to paraphrase Clausewitz, helped conduct the war by other means. In other words, to propagate, okay, the Bengal school. The other way we can think about Chughtai is his growing connection with the efflorescence of literary debates that are beginning to take place in Lahore. So for example, this is his cover design of Muhammad Iqbal's a collection Khizr-e-Rah from 1922. His sort of magnum opus, okay, from his sort of early career is the Muraqqa-e Chughtai, which was published in 1928. Now, this was published by Chughtai himself, self-published in 1928 in a number of, and it took him a lot of trouble to make this. He had to install a press in his own home, right? He had to import a press, install the press, import paper, okay, get the plates printed in Germany or in perhaps in England. And the Muraqqa-e Chughtai comes out in 1928, and really, in a sense, he makes his mark really as a kind of an established artist with the publishing of the Muraqqa-e Chughtai. Okay, and this is the frontispiece of the Muraqqa-e Chughtai with the illumination also done by Chughtai, so just some plates from the Muraqqa. So paintings by. A later work, you can see that Muraqqa-e Chughtai is 1928. Okay, now 40 years later, okay, Chughtai publishes a whole bunch of books during the succeeding years, but a massive volume that is published in 1968 is Amal-e Chughtai, which is his illumination and illustration of Iqbal's verse. So whereas the Muraqqa is based on Ghalib's poetry, the Amal-e Chughtai is based on Iqbal's poetry, right? And in some ways, you can see that it's a 40-year gap between the Amal and the Muraqqa, but he's hardly changed his style in his later career. The other ways in which Chughtai becomes so Iqbal and Ghalib are important interlocutors for him, but as well as living sort of other poets, living artists. Living critics and people the literary intelligentsia which is around him in Lahore, right? So you can see his involvement in these by the book cover designs for the poets Faiz, Noor Meem Rashid, and Fahmida Riaz. Okay, these are all designs by and also his participation in literary circles. Okay, so these are important, a whole galaxy of important writers, and Chughtai is on the upper right, okay, with the white arrow, okay. Also, what you have, interestingly, is also some of the same critics beginning to wrestle with the meaning of Chughtai's paintings, right? So these are just some quotations from the various writings on Chughtai by these literary writers and critics who actually haven't really written on art before, okay? So there's a way in which you can see in the writings that they are grappling with how to think about Chughtai's art and art in particular. And so there are various, I won't read all of them, but the last one says that Chughtai's woman was not a familiar figure, but a picturization of the classical ghazal, the metaphors of the beloved of the classical ghazal, right? A very important sort of fellow traveler and mentor to Chughtai is Muhammad Din Tasir, and they published a journal called Caravan together in 1933. This was a very important initiative. Unfortunately, only 1 or 2 volumes were published. But what was important for me about this journal is that it was centrally dealing with the problem of writing on art, right? And you can see the kind of writings that were published in the first the first volume of Caravan, which includes debates, writings by William Blake, by so writings on art from all eras and from all both on Europe and from India. Okay. And Taseer claims that you need to sort of provide writing and criticism in Urdu on art, and also need to in a sense analyze images so that people become trained to look at modern art, right? There is a number of so he says otherwise it will be something like the Europe Zada young man who just draws a cartoon of the imagery of poetry and claims that this is adequate. Faiz also reflects on Chughai's verse, which Faiz has reflects on Chughai's painting by suggesting that he's retrieving what is being rapidly being lost, to memory. How am I doing for time?
You can take a few moments.
Yeah. Okay. So Chughai himself was a prolific writer, and he, in his writings, he's appreciative of Western Renaissance masters as well as Persian painters, etc. But he's quite disparaging of modern art, right? So he's quite disparaging of Picasso and Cubism, okay? And nevertheless, this lament is quite remarkable. He says, if only we had our own experimental abstract art like the French, even if it wasn't anything other than the most modern and avant-garde art. That's not a good thing for him, right? At least it would have been ours, okay? Okay. Now, what happens in the subsequent generation of artists from Lahore is that they actually reject Chughai's position regarding his position regarding modern art, and actually embrace modern art wholeheartedly. One important person, just some images from mid-century of art schools and exhibitions. Another key person who becomes a very important artist later in his career is Anwar Jalal Shamsa. During the 50s, he publishes several novels in Urdu, and also the cover designs are also done by Shamsa. And you can see he's a founding member of this group of modern artists called the Lahore Art Circle, which were active in the 50s. And there were several of them, and this is a later work by Shamsa, and in this later work you can still see the relationship between kind of textuality and painting, that from where really his career begins. Let's look at the Mayo School of Art picture again. It's been renamed the National College of Art in 1958. Shakir Ali becomes principal in 1962. Shakir Ali is also a person who remains deeply associated with the literary intelligentsia, okay? And so the noted critic Askari writes very well on Shakir Ali, actually. The writings on Shakir Ali by Askari are quite exemplary in terms of his ability to analyze painting. And just some works by Shakir Ali from the 50s and 60s. Shakir Ali in conversation with Faiz in the later 60s. And Shakir Ali's own writings on art are not extensive, but they're quite deep, okay? And so you can see his thinking being also informed by existential philosophy as well as debates on modernism, right? So for example, he says the artist has become lonely in today's time to the degree that one has been estranged from one's very self, right? And in that sense, Shakir Ali would position himself against Chughai by suggesting that modern art is actually an authentic way to represent the dilemmas of the self in the modern age, right? And that's brought up very well in this quite humorous letter, okay, that he writes, which is it's a letter to the 15th century Persian, legendary Persian painter Behzad, okay, in which he says, of your legacy of Asia as the center of civilization, only ruins are left, right? The European artistic influences arrived with imperialism, wiping out our cultural entities. The machine age further strangulated its oriental spirit, right? Some painters in the present have struggled to remain faithful to it. Due to their inability to modernize, they've become imitators, okay? And you can see this as a veiled critique of Chughtai, all right? Okay, okay. And this is even more interesting. He says, Matisse, who's recently died, has gone to heaven and has joined you with Behzad. So there is this meeting of an assembly of, great painters from, across the world, right, who are in heaven, and would have informed you of new artistic movements. I can only imagine the free environment in heaven where you all enjoy brotherhood and equality, right, and unity. Okay, okay. And some stubborn artists down here, still living on earth, are also involved in this project of unity, and with your prayers, might well achieve success in deploying art in the service of human brotherhood, right? So there's a way in which, literature, Behzad, okay, criticism, association with the literary sphere becomes a way for both the artists as well as the writers to, in a sense, create a sense of meaning and critical reception for the rise of modern art in a place like Lahore. Otherwise, it would not have been arguably intelligible in the way that it becomes, through this trajectory. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Iftikhar. That was really kind of quintessential Lahore, after 1947 and the intellectual and artistic journey explained through these three key figures, Chughtai, Shamsa, and Shakir Ali. And I'll go to you, Salima, and who is the other icon that comes to your mind in this continuation of Lahore's tradition?
Well, first I want to dispel the notion that it's all been one big happy family. Because each of these people held onto certain very strong commitments vis-a-vis how they looked at art and literature, and then fought over them bitterly. Correct. I mean, as you know, I'm very ancient, probably one of the most ancient in this room. And I remember as a small child these bitter debates in which one artist is yelling at a writer and the artists are yelling between themselves and much thumping of tables with the help of certain libations. But the thing is that, I wonder if the age of the icon is dead. Because it becomes more and more difficult to hold up an icon, either in literature or in art. But I would say that the last great icon in art, as far as, I think, was Zahoor al-Akhlaq. Yes. And I think Zahoor perhaps is one of the most undervalued in terms of the way people buy art. It's not fashionable. But in terms of his thinking, the fact that he was deeply, deeply involved with literature as well as his own work, I think he embodies the best of many of these debates that were happening. And certainly as far as his relationship with Shakir, who was his mentor, is that he was a universalist, like Shakir, but also perhaps more than, I don't know whether I'm putting myself, more than even Shakir, he was deeply aware of the legacies that were embodied in a painter or an artist who dares to be creative in the 20th century, and from our part of the world. So therefore, in all the ways that he thought, in all the ways that he very quietly influenced some of the people who are now the great stars of Pakistani contemporary art, without making a great song and dance about it. Because if you think of his output in terms of any writing or holding forth, it's just not there. The work talks. But one has to take the time to decode it and to look at it in the context of what was going on around him. So Shakir certainly wrote much more. Shakir also did not get into huge fights, unlike Shamsa. But in our time, the icon in art is Zahoor, and yet to be acknowledged. So, but certainly, can't go around. But as I said, is the age of the icon dead?
Yeah.
I think it's been ironed out because of our peculiar political history and social history. When you look at people like Chughtai and Shakir, I mean, look at the diversity there. And the fact that they loathed one another's position, but they were in the same city. When Chughtai died, I mean, I was in Shakir's room. He'd just been to a condolence meeting at the YMCA. And he came into his office and he said, you know, Chughtai up there, when he heard me reading out the message of condolence, must be saying, ye kambakht to yahan bhi mere piche aa gaya. So, you know, this damn chap has followed me over here also. But I think that the desire for Pakistani society for regimentation in certain ways has stamped out the eccentricities and the diversities that are necessary before you can build someone up to be an icon. Because an icon of necessity is not going to kowtow to anybody. Yes, so maybe icons are no more.
True. That's wonderful. So Khaled Sahab, picking on what Salima said on the peculiar social and political histories that we witnessed after 1947, would you like to comment on that and also the icons that you knew and that you have been extensively writing about, both in terms of men and women of letters and artists as well?
Yeah, if you look at Lahore today, it's not very much like what it used to be when it was more creative. And I think when Razi started his festivals, Lahore festivals, an aspect of it was really a revivalist effort so that we can go back when Urdu ruled Lahore, when Urdu produced masterpieces, when great people lived here. And there was a legacy, let's say, going back into the British Raj, which gave rise to pluralism. Although Lahore was dominated by Muslims, 40% was Hindus and Sikhs, but most of the property was owned by Hindus and Sikhs, and the Muslims were not really educating themselves. But the fact is that things were changing as Pakistan was established. And as she mentioned, that we hardened, there was some kind of regimentation. And I think that regimentation you can see far back. For instance, I'll give you just one example. And let me first say that it is all about Urdu. Yes. Because Urdu was created and promoted by Lahore and was associated with Lahore. And there was Hafiz Mahmud Sherani in Lahore, who was a great researcher. That research is now vanished. But he claimed that Urdu was born in Lahore, not in Delhi. The only problem was...
heresy.
The only problem was the word Urdu. Because that could only be said by Uzbeks, the Mughals who came here, because they had borrowed it from the Mongols. So the Mongols, when they were, let's say, 300 years ruling over the Russians, they were called Zalataya Orda. So it was Orda. When they fell upon Europe, they called it the Golden Horde. So today, when you say horde, you're actually saying Urdu.
Okay.
So it is contestable whether Urdu was born in New Delhi or it was born in Lahore. But Hafiz Mahmud Shirani insisted that it was born here. And then, of course, if you look at the creative side of Urdu literature, you will find that most of the big people were here under British Raj. And then something started happening immediately after 1947. And you can see it in Manto writing about the day after. It's amazing that he wrote a sketch, and he was heavily into sketches because he could go into a newspaper's office, write it out in 5 minutes and collect his money and then go and drink. But he said the man is walking the street right after 1947, but somehow he doesn't like it anymore. He's more critical. He's judgmental about how people walk, how people dress. The signboards are all wrong. So he was pointing out that you have changed after 1947. And of course, he didn't like the separation, and he was a fantastic writer of style. And I think we haven't really gone out of this love for his style, because he straightened out Urdu. It's a magical style. It's more akin to how you speak. In the past, it was not like that. There was a lot of metaphor and poetic similes, and he got rid of that. And my friend Khaled Hassan translated him, and he's also a stylist in English, the sort of English that you find it very easy to read. So Lahore was remembered for Urdu, for its Urdu writers, Urdu literary writers. But the fact is that it is no more that. So we have a lot of nostalgia about Lahore and how people lived here, how the literary giants of Urdu lived here and produced their work. And of course, we can go into why it is no longer so. And I think next time I speak, I'll go back to Salima's word, regimentation.
Yes, I think it's a great phrase to be used. But anyway, I'll go back to Iftikhar. And so, do you think this the relationship that you showed through as an art historian, does it still continue? Does it manifest in contemporary times? And if so, what are its manifestations?
Yeah, so there's definitely we are in a different, arena now, right? So in some ways you can see this. I mean, despite the fact that they fought, in fact, fighting about things means that it's important, right? Yeah. So in a way, it creates a discursive field of debate and contestation, okay, which moves things forward. So we don't necessarily have the same regime of, the relation between art and literature the way we had in earlier times, and I agree completely with Salima but what we do have is, I think, in contemporary art has, in some sense, created its own terms of legibility, yes. Right? And it doesn't need to rely so much on on the word anymore. And maybe Zahur is the pivot,
yes,
in this. But having said that, of course, there are writers who are increasingly becoming interested in art. And Salima published the last book she published had. She invited 4 important, fiction writers to reflect on 4 artists. So these things, I think this debate is, perhaps we are entering a new relationship, a new set of, a new conversation, Right. I'm not sure if creativity has declined. I think it has shifted I think if you look at contemporary art is, I would say the galaxy of contemporary art is what the writers might have been in the 1950s, yeah. Right? In some ways. So I would be hesitant to say that repression automatically kills creativity. I'm not comfortable with those kinds of associations.
Repression is a great breeding ground, I think, for creativity. Because artists and writers are, for want of a better word, a polite word would be resistant or resilient. Impolite way would be they're bloody minded and they just will go against whatever the order is, and good for that too.
Yeah, so Khalid Saab, my last question, and then we'll open it to the audience, would be, so you agree with this repression and creativity relationship, and what Pakistan and Lahore and of course Pakistan at large has undergone in the last 40 years, with this increasing signs of radicalization or other such trends.
I think the British introduced pluralism into Lahore. The governor was presiding over this, and Hindus, Sikhs, and Muslims were kind of more or less forced to mix and not target each other. So Khushwant Singh, who lived in Lahore, and father has sent him to pursue a very good lawyer's career. He said, we are all okay, the elite will mix with each other, but somehow when I go to the bar room in Lahore High Court, Hindus and Sikhs and Muslims are seated separately. They don't mix at all. In 1947, suddenly, the elite, of course, was still okay, but the common man started killing each other. And at that point, Khushwant Singh was taken in his car, because Khushwant said, I will never leave Lahore, I love Lahore. And then, of course, Manzoor Kadir, his friend, from the elite class, put him in his car and, took him across the border, and that's how his life was saved.
Yeah.
But it goes much earlier. Actually, the conflict between English, the imposition of English in India, or the revival of the local languages.
Right.
And I will just point out to one instance, which is, I think, very interesting, is there was a Jewish person from Hungary named Leitner who had written a huge book on the madrasas of Punjab. And he got the job in Lahore to open Government College, Lahore. And he first was in Arcali, and then he shifted to the Mound, where now Lahore College, Government College of Lahore is actually situated. And he gave a motto to, and I think he must have gone through some very torturesome moments, because he gave the motto of courage to know, which of course Faiz revived by saying Jurat-e-Tahqiq and all that. And that was also very secretly. But the fact is that he took the motto from enlightenment. He was an enlightenment scholar, because he found that it was enlightenment which improved a lot of the Jews in Europe. And enlightenment replaced religion and church. And he took this from Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, who had written a small essay on enlightenment. But he headed it with a Latin phrase, sapere aude. And he had taken it from Horace, an Italian poet. Now, we have 2 volumes history of Government College, Lahore.
That's right.
But nobody mentions where the motto came from. I think that Leitner was scared that if he said, okay, now I am preaching enlightenment, which supersedes religion, the Muslims won't like it. The proof of that is that he had employed a very learned person from Delhi, Maulvi Muhammad Hussain Azad, who has also given us a writing style which simply can't be imitated. It's simple, it's direct, it's not like the florid style of the past. And he he presided over a new subject called Ulume Mufida, the useful knowledge.
Yeah.
For the first time, the Muslims were asked to learn something useful. The fact is that for the first 30 years, after the establishment of Government College Lahore, it was an idyllic place. For 30 years, there was not a single Muslim graduate from there. Now, the Hindus and the Sikhs latched onto it, and they will remember Government College forever. But then the Sikandar Hayat came, the chief minister, and said, I want a quota for Muslims in Government College Lahore. That's how the Muslims got it. Right. The fact is that despite the pluralism, for instance, Leitner hated Macaulay. He said, why English? Let us revive our own local languages. And he wanted Urdu to actually be the embodiment of that. And he was a fantastic person, but he never let on why the motto was courage to know and what it really meant.
So we have few minutes left. We'll take 2 or 3 questions. So keep them very short. First one. Yes, please.
My question is to Salima Hashmi. Please use the mic. My name is Sabiha Rahman, and I am a writer. I'm fascinated by your mention of being regimented, the desire to be regimented, and how that can interfere with being creative. And if I may challenge you, I feel that, in my case, personally speaking, being regimented instills a certain amount of discipline in me, which enables me to be productive and to meet deadlines, even if they're my own deadlines. So if you can speak a little bit more about why that would prevent being creative, because in my case it seems to be the other way around.
Why? I'll just give you a small example about how fear has been instilled into a creative person. Ideally, whether it's the word or whether it's the image, there should be a degree of freedom of expression. But we know over the years that these have been slowly whittled away, and there's a tremendous amount of self-censorship. There has been, as a teacher, I address this when a student is, for example, doing a thesis, and I look at something and I can see where it's headed, and I want them to make an intelligent assessment about whether a certain law, which is in evidence, would be contravened if they continue the way that they are. And that artist, young artist in the making, has to make that choice. The regimentation that I referred to is at many levels, and some of that is to do with law also, the laws that have come into place since the 1980s, and how they have whittled away personal expression. So I don't know if that begins to outline what I was referring to, but certainly artists have to make choices which may or may not be to the best of their talent. There was a particular work that a student was doing, and I saw immediately that it could lead to the idea that this was blasphemous, even though it was entirely to do with literature.
Maybe I can add a little bit to that. I think when oppression is under a despot, people take to literature to voice, creatively voice their objection to it. But when you have oppression under ideology, then literature simply dies, and that is what is happening to Pakistan. After the death of Intezar Hussain, you can't name a novelist in Pakistan who is of any value. But let me tell you about this regimentation. When Plato wrote his Republic, he was copying the Spartan model, and he banned poetry. In that ideal republic that he created, he banned poetry. It is incomprehensible, but it happened in Pakistan, especially in Lahore, which became a very conservative city compared to Karachi of those days. That there is absolute, for instance, when the Tsar was ruling Russia, the best Russian literature was produced under that. But that doesn't mean that the regimentation was not allowed. It was allowed, but under that regimentation, it was possible to do something creative. But when you are under ideology, you simply dry up, and that is what is happening. There's no longer much resistance.
But I think the problem is self-censorship.
Yes, that I think, and that applies to writers and journalists as well.
Yes.
So the media keeps on self-censoring. I mean, as a instinct now.
Because don't like writers and artists find other ways, right?
Yes,
they find
exactly.
allegory, they find metaphor, they find kind of displaced abstraction.
Absolutely.
There are many ways to kind of think about your own place in society.
The result of this has been that the work has become much more nuanced. I'll say this for the fine arts.
Yeah, so
the work is tremendously nuanced. You have to decode it and read into it meanings that perhaps are even beyond the artist. So it makes the audience work harder. And I think that is a tremendous thing. In Lahore, I think we're evolving a great audience.
Okay, one question from here. So we only have this is the second last, and then...
Very quick. I went to see Bashir Mirza after he came back from Australia, and he had an exhibition. This was soon after Ziaul Haq's period. And he said, I could not produce anything during this period. And now we are free, and I can now practice my art. So there is some relationship. But I wanted to refer to the over-intellectualization of art versus the visual dimensions of art. Because I remember my friend Shahid Sajjad, God forbid if you were with him, you got submerged with the meaning of every little thing, and it bored you to death while you looked at the piece, and it was a beautiful piece. So we have artists like Waqas or Talpur today who are drawing lines. I don't know what they mean, but they look damn good. So my question is the difference between how we are talking about art and how modern art has evolved. Secondly, there are no icons in the West either. So this whole concept of having a big name, hardly, even if you look at the art scene today, where is the big name? There are no big names. Big names are those who are marketed well and sell well. So they become sought after objectives. Thank you.
Oh,
well, the market is an issue, but I think the good thing today in Pakistan is every week you find at least 3 exhibitions that are of merit. And these are young artists who don't have an eye on the market, actually. They're doing the work because they must. And at least for me, as a viewer and somebody who is interested in art education, it is amazing that in current circumstances, where it is very difficult to sell work, the work keeps happening. And every week there's something extremely interesting, new, fresh, with searching for vocabulary, inventing vocabulary. And, you and I, because I have to, because I'm a teacher and I have to be there, would never hear of those people, really. But it's extremely reassuring that they're there and they're working and their work is being seen, even though it's by a small audience, because necessarily Pakistani art, doesn't have a big picture except for, as you say, the stars. Last month, I have been to Mardan, to Faisalabad, to Bhavalpur. Not exactly the great art centers that you hear about, but interesting work happening in all of these places. So
I agree completely. I think there is no cause for despair. Okay, I think that what is happening, at least in the contemporary art realm, is a very exciting, and quite a multifaceted development in various centers, different ways of making art. In Karachi, for example, there is more practice that deals with archives and mapping that you don't find so much in Lahore, right? So, in other words, that's a good thing, because there's no one way to make art. Just is the case that we have no one issue that we are dealing with. We are dealing with a whole multifaceted range of issues. Some are personal, some are social, some are political, so you want to have a diverse ecology and range of practices and different kinds of patronage structures that enable them, and also different kinds of structures of legibility and recognition, and I think that's happening. And it's important for people who are not so well versed in contemporary art I would urge them to pay attention actually to what's going on. In Lahore alone, you will have something like over 100, perhaps several hundred artists that are of interest.
I mean, using a place like Javed Manzil, Allama Iqbal's home, I mean, it used to be a dead place. But, 2 months ago, an artist brought her work there and showed her work in conversation with the belongings of Iqbal in Javed Manzil. And you should have seen the school children and so on. They came to see Javed Manzil, but there was the work of a contemporary artist thrown in as well. And Sir Jalil's work was really fine, really fine. It had some, something. Her grandfather was a friend of Allama. That's how she thought of having the show there. But it's also because the galleries didn't have space for her. So she went and found a new venue. And, they invited her in. So there are these places that are being opened up, spaces, old factories, whatever. And
so we are just out of time, so I would actually... okay.
Zeba, you have to
quickly, yes.
So first of all, Shaukat, to reframe the question that you put forward about where are the big names, I would say, where is the big imagination coming from in any discipline? Visual art, literary art, music, and other performative arts. Where are they popping up in thinkers, amongst journalists? And how are they being subversive and deliciously subversive?
Can I say one?
Yes, please, Khaled Sahab.
Yeah, I think that the artists and people who are into cinematography, they get away easy. But if you go with the printed word, I think that is more dangerous. Because everybody can read it, the seminaries can read it, and the great clerical leaders can read it, and they can then attack you. And it's very easy for them to attack with the help of people. And I remember there was a time when people loved cricket and everybody was looking up to Imran Khan as the rising icon. And suddenly Dr. Israr Ahmed emerged in Lahore as the big leader of the clergy. And he was also in the Lahore gardens where Imran used to play. And he gave a sermon, actually, which endangered Imran's life, was that he said, look at the lasciviousness of Imran's rubbing the ball on his groin. And of course, the time came when the Sri Lankan cricket team was playing in Lahore when it was attacked and nearly killed. And we haven't had international cricket in Lahore since then, since 2011. So if you are in the printed word, there are people who will latch on to it. For instance, in Iran, where ideology is supreme, the cinema can get away with it, but not the written word.
So I just want to say that perhaps I'm alone in this panel, but I'm not comfortable with the language of resistance, okay? Because I think it can become too reactive. And I'm much more comfortable with thinking about cultural projects as projects of investigation and becoming, okay? Set against various kinds of strictures and possibilities. And I'd really like to think of it that way rather than think about kind of resistance and reaction, which can become perhaps too instrumental a relationship.
So I hope that answers your question. Huh? Okay, great.
And the lasciviousness of cricket should be kept in mind.
And look where it got Imran Khan.